He's a practicing institutional ethnographer. So he tells us what it is. I'd like to know. Institutional ethnography is a way of studying how things work from the standpoint of the oppressed, so that collectively we can bring about transformational changes in our society. Jean-Louis has a master's degree in wildlife management from MacDonald College at McGill University, and a PhD in interdisciplinary studies from the University of New Brunswick. He's been involved in the anti-shale gas movement in New Brunswick since June 2010, served as the first chair of the Anti-Shale Gas Caucus in 2011 under the New Brunswick Environmental Network, and has published in February 2014 an article on fracking in Alternatives Journal. His presentation today is a snapshot of the disconnect between what New Brunswickers told Louis Lapierre in 2012 for the Citizen Engagement Tour and what the government is doing.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. In 2012, the Allward government commissioned Louis Lapierre to go out into the communities, except for the big cities, stay away from the big cities, and talk to people, talk to us, find out what we thought about their proposed recommendations for regulating the shale gas industry. How many of you attended those meetings? I see quite a few hands. Many of you will probably remember that Lapierre's findings didn't actually reflect what many of us told him at these meetings. So that's what I want to talk about this afternoon. I think Charles and Don did a really good job at giving us a macro picture of what's going on. I want to really go down to the grassroots and provide you an example of how the shale gas regulation scheme is not working to our advantage, but to the advantage of the government and industry. So if I could have the next slide, please. I originally was going to talk about the royalty structure, but I'm very happy that Don spoke about that, so I'm going to skip that. And I will be talking about in the next few minutes on the 12 principles, the 10 commandments, if you wish, that guided the establishment of the recommendations for shale gas regulations. Then I'm going to mention how it is that public health, our health, actually got removed from those guiding principles. I want to give you two examples of testimonials from people who actually came to speak to Lapierre. Then I want to talk about ideology, a little bit about ideology, and go on into something that I refer to as science now dictating our policies as opposed to informing our policies at the expense of some of our other values. So if I could have the next slide, please. So, no, the one before, perfect. What you see at the bottom of this slide, and I think it's pretty easy to read, I'll translate it in English. This was a person who came to the microphone. He was the first person who went to the microphone in Beauharnois. And he represented the Federation of Senior Citizens for New Brunswick, representing something like 19,000 people. This was the Francophone Federation. And what he said was basically this: as people get older, they get richer as long as they have their health. And that's basically the starting point for my presentation. So if I could have the next slide, please. Institutional ethnography, as Louise mentioned, is a method that enables you to figure out how things work. It's been developed by Canadian sociologist Dorothy Smith in the mid-1980s. It's been used in education, as you see on the slide. It's been used in studies on military wife abuse by Deborah Harrison, and I've used it in some of my work on disability studies. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's a disconnect between what Lapierre heard from us and what we told him. So the bottom line here is that IE, or institutional ethnography, is used to figure out how we are being screwed. Is that plain enough for people to understand? Good. Now, the discussion paper was entitled Responsible Environmental Management of Oil and Gas Activities in New Brunswick. Louis Lapierre, along with members of the Natural Gas Group, visited 9 communities and listened to our concerns. Now, at the time that this was happening, I was chairperson of the Anti-Shale Gas Caucus, or the Shale Gas Caucus, under the umbrella of the Brunswick Environmental Network, as Louise mentioned. And one of the strategies that we decided at that time was that we would attend at least 2 of these meetings, the Buchter's meeting and the Norton meeting. Well, it so happens that we attended all meetings, which was great. Next slide, please. At each and every meeting, the first thing that the Natural Gas Group did, as many of you will remember, is there was always somebody presenting an outline of what they were going to be talking about. They started by listing the principles, the 12 principles upon which they based their recommendations for the shale gas industry. And I've listed 8 of these on this slide. And if you take a look at the bottom one on the left-hand side, this is the principle that came out in a news release in December of 2011. It says that protecting public health is a founding principle of the establishment of these rules and regulations. But look at what happened 5 months later down the road. When we met with Lapierre in May of 2012, number 8 has changed. It's no longer public health, it's public safety. Apples and oranges. Next slide, please. Protecting public health, if you read some of the information that Dr. Cleary has presented, and also she talks about this herself from time to time, protecting public health is about maximizing the health benefits in minimizing health risks. Whereas public safety is about, well, what are we going to do? What plans are we going to implement to make sure that if there's an accident during a fracking operation that we have an emergency plan in place? There's 2 different things there. Next slide, please. Every meeting, and I've listened to all of the tapes, and I have transcripts of all of those meetings. At every single meeting, people went to the microphone and said time and time again, there's nothing that's more important to us than our health. In just a second, I'm going to ask Terry to bring the voice of a woman from Hillsborough who expressed her concerns about the fact that we are not doing enough to ensure that this process is safe. So, Terry?
We have another chemical that's called, actually it's a constituent, and it's called propyl alcohol. When we hear the name alcohol, we think, well, it can't be that bad. After all, we all drink alcohol. But things are not always the way they may seem. Pass number 107197, the propyl alcohol has a OSHA permissible exposure of 1 part per million over an 8-hour work shift. How many of us living in our homes are going to experience an 8-hour work shift? How many of our children are going to experience an 8-hour work shift? In other words, these data, these safety measures, have been brought down based on 8-hour work shifts and usually also the exposure to healthy, middle-aged subjects, in other words, adults. Propyl alcohol is classified as an RCRA, hazardous waste. It is designated under EPA's CERCLA as a hazardous substance. The chemical has been added to the toxic release inventory, therefore is reportable under Section 313 of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act in the United States. It's also listed under the Pollution Prevention Act of 1990. With regards to toxicity of propyl alcohol, we don't have anything in regards to humans. We have animal exposure only. A lot of experiments are not conducted on humans because they would not be considered to be ethical. You have to go through an ethical review committee, I'm sure many of you know that. Toxicity information is limited to acute and subchronic studies, but propyl alcohol has a high order of acute toxicity by the oral, dermal, and inhalation of exposure. It is irritating to eyes, skin, and respiratory tract. Repeated oral or inhalation exposure has produced liver and kidney damage. So I suppose to sum things up, I could go on to another chemical, but I won't. To sum things up, my question is, who's going to assure that the limits that are actually set, the few limits that are actually set, the few parameters that have been actually put around these chemicals, is going to protect my 8-year-old grandson from anything beyond 1 part per million in 8 hours? Because that's a question I think that we all, as parents and grandparents in New Brunswick, need to know the answer to. This requires strict adherence and monitoring. I don't believe regulation is going to cover it all for any of us, at least not this grandparent. Thank you very much.
So this woman who came to the microphone and was talking about propyl alcohol and the fact that we don't have enough information, toxicity information on this chemical, yet nothing is being done about it. This was a valid concern that she put forth before the panel. And look at the response that she got from the panel. I'll read it. The moderator said, "I thank you very much. We've taken note of your presentation. We're going to get through as many people as we can. Please, sir." In other words, thank you for your information. Next person in line to speak to the microphone. Her concerns were completely dismissed. Next slide. Time and again, every time that a person went to the microphone and spoke about public health issues, there was no response from the panel other than this. It's no longer within our mandate, it's being looked after by Department of Health. Next slide, please. If you were to take a look at the rules for industry, which came out in 2013, and you made a comparison with what appeared in the discussion paper in 2012, for each of those 12 guiding principles, you will see that they pretty much match. They're pretty much a mirror image of one another. The only thing, and I've basically showed you an example here of number 11. They've taken the head off the first two on the left-hand side, and they've basically maintained the last 4 in that section. Next slide, please. Now, responsible environmental management. Every time that I hear that term, it makes me angry. Because what's happened is government has taken a human value for its own benefit, for its own purposes. What does being responsible really mean? I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I went home to visit my folks in Nova Scotia. I hadn't seen them for a while. I was in my 40s, married, had my own family. I went to a friend's house. He has a canoe for every day of the week. I asked him if I could borrow a canoe. He said, "Sure, go ahead." So I went out and I was having a grand old time. I hadn't been on the water for a while. When I got home, it was after dark. My father gave me the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degree. And he had every reason to do so, even though I'm an adult. I had forgotten the first lesson that I learned when I was a kid back home, responsibility. They didn't know what had happened to me. They are not canoeists. For all they knew, I had drowned. Or given my size, I could have been eaten by a hungry bear. So, being responsible is something that I'm sure everyone here can identify with. But when government or industry borrow a human value, they have to shore it up. They have to construct it so that we somehow recognize it. And this is what they've done. And the way that I explain it is through the creation of an ideological circle. If you look at the middle rectangle in that slide, you will see discussion paper. We had an opportunity to provide information during the citizen engagement tour in terms of what was going to be introduced in that discussion paper. But everything that did not fit within those 12 guiding principles didn't get included, like public health. So the discussion paper intended what was going to be written in the rules, and the rules were basically being manifested by what we first saw in the discussion paper. it creates a tight circle. It's an impenetrable circle. It's so impenetrable that there's no way at this point in the game to introduce any of the recommendations in the Cleary report. Next slide, please. The other thing that I learned by doing some analysis of the data is that in order to be engaged with the people who were at the front, sitting at the table, you had to speak their language. You had to speak science. You had to be able to know everything that they knew about well-bore integrity. How many people in this room have conversations around the dinner table about well-bore integrity? Yes, but should we? We were at a tremendous disadvantage when we went to speak to Dr. Lapierre in his panel, because we were compelled to learn things that is really not our responsibility. This was an unfair process, and if we had an ombudsman worth his salt, he would have called them off on it. Next slide, please. I want to go back to this because a lot of the points that were made by people who went to the microphone, they were about things that you and I all care deeply about: our quality of life, the ability to breathe clean air, the ability to go on the river and enjoy some canoeing, the ability to farm on land that is going to remain pristine. But all of those values disappeared in those discussions. What came front and center is science, and that's an issue. Next slide, please. One of those issues that came up time and time and again was water. In the discussion paper, as well as in the regulations, there's a hierarchy of water. Industry is supposed to use the dirtiest water first and then whittle down to the cleanest potable water. Let's listen for just a sec. This is a short blip from an Aboriginal's perspective on water. Terry?
What I would like to say here in the brief presentation you brought to us is I simply do not understand how water has some kind of hierarchy. Everything to us is in a circle, and that is why our people used to live in balance until this kind of development comes and knocks on the door of everybody, of any and all of our relations. I do not understand how you can replace a water source with something that was as pure and sacred as what was existing there before you fracked. I do not understand how you can replace it with that quality. Our Creator only made a certain amount of water when life was created, when Mother Earth was created. And that water to us is what carries light and what carries life. It has a memory. It has a memory since times immemorial. It has a memory since the beginning of life on the earth. And I do not understand how you can think of fracking this life.
I don't think I need to add any more to that one. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide, because I am really anxious to hear what you folks have to say about solutions. In this presentation, I talked about public health no longer being part of the guiding principles for regulating this industry. I mentioned that responsible resource development, it's a concept, it's a fabrication of government to impose its way of knowing upon the subordinates, upon us. And this point, this last point that I want to make, is something that I hope many of you will reflect upon. Science has taken a new place in our society. It used to be, many years ago, and this was a story that I heard many times told by my mother-in-law, who's from Quebec. She used to say that when she was growing up, the Catholic priests would go from home to home, asking why the woman of the house was not pregnant. How come you're not pregnant? Right? Religion guided policy. We seem to have substituted religion with science. As long as science is used to inform policy, such as protecting biodiversity and protecting hybrid, or rather heritage varieties, that's a good purpose for science to have. But when science is used to define policy, as in the forestry example, and when science becomes policy, for the shale gas example, that should be a huge concern for all of us. Madam Chair.